The night the glass didn't break was the night everything else did. It was a delicate, pearled wineglass, one from the set we'd received on our 20th anniversary, and I watched it teeter on the edge of the counter as if the universe were undecided about mercy. I braced for the shatter that never came. In the space between falling and not falling, something inside me finally did. I'm Lila, 42 years married to a good man named Thomas. He is steadfast the way the horizon is constant, always there, always the same. We built a life that would look beautiful from the outside, a house that never complained, a garden that kept secrets, and two grown children who believed the story we told them because we believed it too. Or we said we did. There are certain truths it takes a lifetime to admit. That silence can become a language, that love can turn into a ritual, that longing can live inside the clean lines of a well-made bed. I used to think the heart was a finite thing, a box with a lock and key. Then I learned it's a church with 1,000 doors, and sometimes it opens to the wrong visitor. His name was Julian. He wasn't new to our lives, and that's what made it worse. He had known Thomas since the days when we measured wealth in dreams and Sundays and late-night fries. He had a laugh that poured warm into a room, and a way of looking at me that made me feel like a story worth listening to. We were careful for years not to recognize the glow between us. Careful the way a moth is careful not to confess its love for the flame. On the night the glass didn't break, Thomas was watching the late game, the TV lighting his face in electric blues. I stood at the counter, hands wet, a dish towel draped over my shoulder like an apology I didn't know how to say. My phone buzzed. A message from Julian. Do you still dream? I don't know why it unnerved me. People ask what you do, not what your dreams are doing, whether they're starving or fed. This is the part where I should make myself smaller, tuck in the edges of this confession. But I promised myself not to do that anymore. The truth is, the question found a hollow place in me and filled it with light. I typed back, sometimes when they're brave enough. He replied, come for a drive. I told myself it was harmless, like walking barefoot on grass still wet with noon. The first lie tastes like mint on the tongue, fresh, almost kind. Thomas called out from the living room for a coaster, and I placed one under his glass, careful, good, practiced. Then I slid my keys into my pocket and told him I needed air. He nodded without looking away from the screen. An entire galaxy could have collapsed behind his eyes, and I might never have known. Julian's car smelled like pine and citrus, a portable forest. He said nothing at first. He didn't need to. We drove the old shoreline road where the houses leaned toward the water like they're eavesdropping. The bay was a sheet of varnished night, the stars hanging low like promises no one could keep. Do you remember when you wanted to open a bookstore? He asked. With a cat and a window seat. You told me that once. I remembered. Of course I remembered. I remembered the imagined dust on hardcover spines and the smell of morning coffee, and the way the bell over the door would sound like a chapel if someone came in quietly. But dreams are expensive, and mortgages are louder. The cat never learned my name because I never learned hers. He parked near the pier and handed me a paper bag with 2 almond croissants, warm as if they'd been held in gentle hands. We ate them leaning against the hood, and my laughter surprised me. It felt like it had muscles again. What do you want, Lila? He asked finally, the kind of question that could ruin a life. And the night exhaled. To be looked at, I said, and wanted to swallow the words back. That was the beginning, only it wasn't. Beginnings are rarely where we think they are. Maybe it started years ago when I chose the curtains he didn't notice, or the day I stopped wearing the perfume he liked because he stopped telling me he liked it. Maybe it started the first time Julian asked about my favorite author, and I remembered what it felt like to be a person who answered that without apology. The next morning, I put the wineglass back into the cabinet and told myself it meant we were safe. We had only learned how to balance. There are thresholds you cross without your feet moving. A week after the pier, Julian sent me a link to an estate sale. They've got first editions. And a clock that looks like it's telling secrets. I shouldn't have gone, so I went. The house was a place that remembered what it once had been, golden frames leaning on walls, mirrors catching the day's last kindness. We wandered separately at first, like museum-goers, like thieves. He found me in a room with lace drapes and a trunk full of letters tied with satin ribbons turned brittle. We read strangers' lives in a hush, each looped Y and flourished G, revealing a world where people wrote about whether the way we talk about desire. They used to name storms and ships and children after hope, he said. What would you name the light that made you? Mine, I felt something dangerous open its eyes. I'd name it Mercy. In the kitchen, a woman in a navy cardigan poured iced tea and told us the clock didn't work, but it was honest with the heart, which might have been a joke or a prophecy. I bought it for $15 and carried it like a relic. Your bookstore can have a clock that refuses time, Julian said. It's only fair. On the drive home, he reached over and touched my wrist, only that, and the air changed temperature. It was the smallest revolution. I learned right then how a body can become a country and a touch can redraw every border. I wanted to pull away to prove I still could. I didn't. I told Thomas only that the estate sale had been interesting. He was in the garage sorting screws into jars, the afternoon sun combing through the dust. Find anything we need? He asked. Need. He was always building the world with that word. What we need, what we can afford, what can be postponed. And maybe that's how he loved me, with blueprints and sturdiness. I stood there, the clock in my hands, and said, just this. He smiled at the clock like it had told him a sweet joke. I leaned in to kiss him on the cheek, and he smelled like cedar and soap and vows. My guilt had a texture, a grit against my teeth. Still, when the house went quiet, I placed the clock on the living room shelf and set it ticking with a battery that wouldn't make it honest any more than new curtains make a room new. Julian and I became students of loopholes. We were careful not to call each other at night, never on weekends, never on birthdays or holidays or the Thursdays when Thomas's sister came for dinner. We made a ritual of harmless times, the hour when nobody expects you to be anywhere but somewhere unimportant. I learned the geography of hidden cafes and scenic roads that understood how to forget. We stole hours the way children steal cookies, clumsy at first, then so good at it we believed it wasn't theft. The first kiss happened on a Tuesday afternoon under an elm tree that had watched lovers make fools of themselves for a century. The breeze was warm and indecent. His mouth met mine, and the world was no longer concerned with economies or sequence. I wanted to tell you it was a mistake, a slip, but it felt like freedom found me with a map it had drawn years ago. After, I cried, quietly, with my face turned toward the sky so gravity could take some of it. He held my hand like a vow he hadn't written yet. We can stop here, he said, before we ruin anything. The sweetness of the lie made me dizzy. We already did, I said, and we kissed again because naming the fire doesn't put it out. At home, Thomas asked if I wanted to watch the documentary on coral reefs. I said yes because saying no would have been suspicious, and also because I wanted to be near something that built itself in quiet prisms. He rested his hand on my knee, and it felt like yesterday touching me, gentle and sure. I closed my eyes and wanted to be split open and cleaned by the sea. In bed, I turned toward the window, the night an unbuttoned shirt. Thomas's breath evened out next to me. I thought of the estate letters, of all the women who wrote to men who left for wars and markets and never wrote back, how their ink didn't dissolve their longing. I wondered if there was a time before I could do this, and whether that version of me was kinder or just more obedient. The clock in the living room ticked once loudly, like a heartbeat learning to lie. I named the light that made me Mercy. That night, I renamed it Hunger. Here is something I learned. When the heart is famished, even ruins look like banquets. We rented a room on the outskirts of town because it promised anonymity and bad lighting. Beige walls, a painting of a meadow that had never met a wind. The kind of place where the sheets felt like they forgave anything. We pretended it was temporary, just a stop, a punctuation mark, a study in survival. But that room became a country with its own laws. I knew the exact sound of the door when it latched, how the springs in the mattress confessed under our weight, the way the air conditioner coughed itself into obedience. We spoke in whispers, as if volume alone could undo the scandal of what we were becoming. In that room, I learned the architecture of Julian's scars, one on his shoulder from a bicycle crash, a white sliver on his chin from a drunken youth, and the invisible one in the soft place under his ribs where a woman had left a long time ago promising to come back. She never did, he said, pressing my hand there, and I felt the cave of him. People leave slowly, I replied, and didn't know then which of us I meant. We made elaborate rules like people make sandcastles in high tide. Never say love. Never talk about the future after noon. Never make promises you can't file away in a drawer labeled, "We were only kidding." The rules made us feel civilized. Our bodies were savages anyway. Outside the room, we were careful. Inside, we were invented. We let language do what it was born to do. soften borders, turn nouns into verbs, make sanctuaries out of breath. He told me I was beautiful in ways I could believe. Odd, precise ways. The gap in my front teeth, the vein at my wrist, the way I tilted my head when I listened like I was pouring him a drink. No one had looked at me like a solved riddle in years. Even on bad days, I felt extraordinary in that room, like a secret garden that bloomed with the door locked. Guilt lived with us. It paid rent. It slept in the chair by the window and read the weather aloud. Sometimes it grew so heavy that I dressed quickly and drove home without touching the radio, without breathing. Other times, desire built a throne and asked guilt to kneel, and it did. Thomas noticed things but didn't know what to call them. He noticed I bought new lipstick. He noticed I stared longer at my reflection as if the mirror had a question I wanted it to repeat. He noticed the clock had moved from the living room to the study. The ticking kept me up, I lied. He nodded as if he owed the clock an apology. One evening, he brought home lilies because he knew they were my favorite ones. The fragrance was outrageous, indecent, a choir of sweetness too big for our quiet kitchen. They reminded me of you, he said. I wanted to break down right there, beg forgiveness for wounds I hadn't confessed to inflicting. Instead, I put the lilies in water and said thank you in a voice that wasn't mine. That night, in the room, I told Julian about the lilies. He remembers me, I said. He always did, Julian replied, and the mercy in his voice made me hate him for a breath. Don't be kind to the part of me that needs to be punished, I said, and he kissed me so tenderly my tears had nowhere to hide. We went to the movies once, sat in the last row like teenagers who believed the dark was a disguise. I held his hand in the scenes where the couple on screen swore to be honest forever, and we laughed into our palms. Coming out, we ran into our neighbor, Ruth. Time slowed enough for panic to watercolor the edges. Ruth chatted about her dog's bad hip, about tomatoes that refused to ripen, and I nodded like my throat was a meadow in the wind. She didn't notice the earthquake between us. Why would she? The world is so exquisitely self-involved. The night after, I couldn't sleep. I watched the neighbor's motion light flicker on and off for no reason, a nervous eye. I thought about the way our life can be both a miracle and an alibi. I wanted to be good. I wanted to be happy. I didn't know how to be both. Every story like this has a crack. Ours arrived as a long, thin line across an ordinary day. Thomas found a receipt in the dryer, crumpled, smudged, stubbornly legible. A boutique cafe in the part of town we never visited together. A Tuesday at 2:17 p.m. 2 almond croissants, 2. The number shocked me more than the words. 2 can indict the soul. He didn't confront me right away. Thomas was a man who preferred evidence to suspicion, diagnosis to symptom. He began to watch the days with a physician's patience, looking for patterns. He asked me to dinner spontaneously, a rarity. "Let's try that tapas place," he said, voice bright. I agreed, scared of the ways I might prefer the food to the truth. At dinner, he held my gaze like a man returning to where he'd buried something and trying to remember exactly where to dig. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was both too much and not enough. I answered in the way people who are drowning answer, "Of course." He nodded like he'd expected as much. "What would make you happier?" he pressed gently. "More time for your projects?" Projects. The word hurt my teeth. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to place my head in his lap and confess like a child who stole from the offering basket. I wanted to say, "I am split in two and both halves are in love with a different future." Instead, I said, "I don't know." He paid the bill and left a good tip. On the walk to the car, we didn't touch. The street hummed with other people's lives being possible. A week later, the house began to listen. The study door stuck the way doors do when they're holding back weather. Thomas asked if Julian could help with the shed roof on Saturday, and my blood went cold and hot like a baptism of wrong. "He's busy," I lied too quickly. Thomas raised an eyebrow, filed the fact away. Then came the voicemail. I had been careless. I had been greedy with the belief that the universe was on my side. Julian called while I was in the shower. He left a message. I still don't know why. "Lila," he said, his voice a breath carrying a name, "I can't stop thinking about the way you looked at me today. I'll meet you at the room at 3. If you change your mind, I'll understand and I'll wait there anyway." His kindness could have killed me. Thomas listened to it first. I came downstairs to find him in the kitchen, asking the air for help with his breath. He looked at me like the horizon had moved. He pressed play again. We stood in the cathedral of what was now undeniable. The message ended, and all the sounds in the house became foreign. The refrigerator an animal, the clock a threat, my heart beat a knock at a door I didn't want to open. "Who is he?" Thomas asked quietly. The quiet was worse than any storm. I told him. I told him too much and not enough. It didn't matter. The truth is a blade. It doesn't care how gently you hold it. He left the kitchen and sat on the front steps, hands clasped, the posture of a man praying or surrendering. Our neighbor's wind chime sang like a child who didn't know better. I sat beside him, and we watched a pair of teenagers ride their bikes past, their laughter a bright cruelty. "Was I blind?" he asked. "No," I said, knowing it was both true and a lie. "You were trusting." He nodded, and his mouth trembled and then stilled itself like a lake after a thrown stone. "Do you love him?" The question broke open a season in me. "I love the person I am with him," I said. "I don't know if that's the same thing." He stood and went inside without slamming the door. I followed like a shadow that forgot how to be useful. That night, he slept in the guest room, and I lay in our bed listening to the ghost of us argue in the pipes. The house knew our names. It refused to say them back. Thomas wanted to meet Julian. "If I have to bleed, I'd rather do it awake," he said. We chose neutral territory, a coffee shop with too many windows. I sat between them, a geography problem the map refused to solve. Thomas's face was pale with dignity. Julian's was flushed with shame. No one raised their voice. That almost made it worse. Thomas asked questions like a man filing an insurance claim after a flood, clear, necessary, unkind only in their accuracy. How long? How often? Did we plan to keep going? Were there promises? We told him the version of the truth that wouldn't set the room on fire. It burned anyway. "Do you want to be with my wife?" Thomas asked at last, cleanly. Julian winced like the word wife had fangs. "I want her to be who she wants to be," he said. "If that's with me, then yes. If it isn't, then I want her to be free." It was the most beautiful and most useless thing he could have said. Thomas looked at me then, like he was trying to memorize a face that was about to disappear. "I loved you by building," he said. "I didn't know you needed to be seen." The words found a place in me that once had been hunger and was now only grief. "I should have told you," I said. "I should have asked for the things I turned into secrets." We separated the next day. No slammed doors, no police of the soul, just bags packed with quiet precision. I moved into a rented apartment with creaking floors and a view of a brick wall that wore rain like a suit. I took the clock with me. I couldn't stand the ticking in his house without me. Julian came by with plants that looked like hope if hope needed misting twice a week. We tried to be gentle with our victory. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like standing in a room without curtains, unable to decide whether to love the light or hate it for being honest. We attempted an ordinary love. We made grocery lists. We argued about laundry. We laughed in the aisles over an absurd cereal mascot. And at night, sometimes, we cried for no reason except that happiness had come at a cost that our bodies were still calculating. I called Thomas every few days because the absence felt like a staircase my feet kept missing. We talked about practicalities, mortgage, utilities, the custard recipe his mother had left us in cursive that leaned forward like it was rushing somewhere. Once he asked if I was safe. I realized no one had asked me that in months and how necessary the question was, how it grew a soft animal in my chest. "Yes," I said, and for a moment I almost was. When my daughter found out, because of course she would, she came to the apartment with a tote bag of orange tulips and fury. "You were the map," she said, crying without touching me. "Now I don't know where I live." I held her and took her anger like rain on my back. "I'm still your mother," I said weakly, and she pulled away because the weakest truths are the heaviest to carry. That night I dreamed of the bookstore. A small bell, a sleepy cat, a clock that didn't measure anything but wonder. When I woke, the apartment smelled like coffee and apology. Julian kissed my forehead and said, "We could still do it, you know." I didn't know that was the trouble. Here is something I owe the world. Not a defense, but a witness. Months passed. The scandal thinned into a narrative strangers could metabolize. Thomas began taking long walks at dusk, sending me photos of skies that looked like bruised peaches. "You used to name the colors," he wrote once. I stared at the photo until I could taste the color. "Tangerine, smoke, forgive." I sent back, and he replied with a single heart, not because he forgave me, but because he understood the grammar I meant. Julian and I tried to build a life that could hold both the tenderness we felt and the damage we had done. I volunteered at the library, a small penance, a small joy. I found a storefront for rent with a window that begged for books. The lease was too much, the repairs were stubborn, the shelves would need hands. "We can ask Thomas," Julian said gently, half a joke, and I laughed until the laugh broke in the middle. On a rainy Sunday, Thomas came to the apartment to drop off a box of photographs I had forgotten, a sliver of our history bound in lamplight. He stood in my doorway and smelled like the life we made. We sat at the small table, three people in a story that had stopped pretending to be anything else. We talked about gutters and the best Thai place and the road repair on Elm. Normality is such a noble actor. When he stood to leave, he touched the clock on the shelf. "Still pretending?" he asked. "Always," I said, and for a second we were us again, worn, warm, ridiculous. He turned to Julian and said, "Take care of her." It wasn't a blessing. It wasn't a threat. It was a benediction for a world where people keep losing and trying anyway. That night, I went for a walk alone. I passed the old shoreline road and the pier where we started to end something and begin something else. The bay was a mirror holding secrets. I stopped at the estate sale house that now stood empty, its windows blank as healed scars. I thought of the letters tied with satin and the woman in the navy cardigan and all the names we give to the light. Mercy, hunger, home. I realized I could open the bookstore. Not because a man loved me or because another did not, but because I had a room inside me that had always been full of spines and dust and courageous quiet. I could do it slowly, clumsily, honestly. I could fail and still deserve the morning. When I came back, I told Julian, "I need to build something that doesn't ask anyone to bleed." He nodded like love had taught him listening. "Then I'll carry the boxes," he said. I wrote Thomas the next day, "I'm sorry." He wrote back, "I know." Then after a pause, "So am I." We met later that week on a bench with peeling paint and we talked like old friends or like people who had survived a fire and still smelled smoke. He didn't forgive me that day. I didn't forgive myself. But forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. It's a landscape you learn to travel, mile by patient mile. The bookstore opened on a Friday because Fridays forgive the slow. A bell sang like a bird that had once been bound. I placed the clock on a shelf where the afternoon light touched its face like a mother. It still didn't tell time. It told truth. People came. They came for mystery novels and poetry, for maps and atlases and instruction manuals for lives they couldn't live. A little girl with a chipped front tooth asked if the cat had a name. "Mercy," I said, and she nodded like the world had finally behaved. Sometimes Thomas stands in the doorway with a paper cup and asks for a recommendation. Sometimes Julian fixes a wobbly shelf and makes a pun so bad I have to feign outrage. Sometimes I am alone in the afternoon, with the dust and the sun, and I think of all the women who wrote letters across oceans and deserts and kitchens, and how the heart learns by doing what it shouldn't, and how sometimes it learns by listening to a ticking that never wanted to be a clock. If this story means anything, let it be this. We are messy and we are made of choices and consequences and the ache for a life that looks like our own face. A glass won't always shatter. Sometimes it will balance on the edge and teach you what you're made of. Sometimes it will fall. And sometimes, if you are very brave and very sorry, you will learn to catch it with both hands and set it down in the center of the table, unbroken and honest, and watch the light move through it like a promise you can keep. Light move through it like a promise you can keep.